Neil D. Brown, welcome back to Shrink Wrap Radio.
David, thanks so much for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, well, I say welcome back because I believe that this might be your third appearance on the show. And previously, we've spoken about your groundbreaking book, Ending the Parent-Teen Battle. And twice we discussed interesting slip of the tongue there, we discussed preventing parental burnout. Mm-hmm. And that may involve disgust, as a matter of fact.
So yeah, right.
That's where my slip came from.
Yeah.
So I also want to take this opportunity to thank you for being a longtime financial supporter of Shrink Wrap Radio. And I have to say that your faithfulness in that and generosity has really helped to keep my fires burning. And so here I am all these years later, still doing this.
Yeah. So, and I think it is important when you provide a service like you provide for our therapeutic community that we all do our part to say thanks and let's keep it going.
Good. I appreciate that. And I've wanted to have you back on the show for some time. And then it really hit me that you are the perfect person to explore the impact of this pandemic that we've been in for 4 years and maybe more. We don't know. So I'm wondering, what's been the impact of the pandemic on your own life?
On my life, my wife, Eileen, and I have gotten off really easy. Our two sons are emancipated, independent, and doing very well for themselves in their lives. And so we weren't raising kids. I've already been Zooming with clients all across the country. Prior to leaving the office and everyone Zooming as an alternative to in-person counseling. So that was not a significant shift for me.
Yeah.
So other than really missing our kids and missing our friends, we set up in the good weather and even in the marginal weather, we set up a heater in the backyard and
nice.
and had our friends over for with social distancing and backyard entertainment for when permitted, and now things are easing up, and we've been able to be with our children and be with our friends again, and with vaccinations and boosters, life has become better. It's not entirely normal, but it's a heck of a lot better. So thanks for asking. We did great.
Well, that's great. We made out not quite as well. We had a family Christmas soiree at my daughter's house, and 4 of us ended up coming down with the latest version of the pandemic.
Aye.
And it wasn't very long lasting. It wasn't all at the same time. It was sort of sequential. I got it. My wife got it. 2 of our adult sons got it. But we're all over it now. And it wasn't that, quotes, that bad.
Well, I'm really happy to hear that you got a version that your body could manage. Excellent.
Yeah, me too. And so
many have died. We've lost so many so many people, and people have gotten sick and with long I forget to call it long-term COVID, and there are a lot of horror stories out there. So I'm really glad that yours is not one of those.
Yeah, me too. And so has it impacted your family therapy practice? You seem to suggest that maybe it hasn't, that you are already operating in a mode that is well adapted to the situation.
Yeah. So the impact it's had has really been on the families and the children teens, young adults that I'm working with. This pandemic has really impacted families in very profound ways, in lots of stages of family development, of child, adolescent, and young adult development has all been significantly impacted for so many kids.
Yeah, we'll talk about, you mentioned a lot of categories there. Maybe you can kind of break it down and talk about some of those.
Yeah. So if you think about it, so many kids were not going to school and they were having virtual school, but certain kids in certain age groups are not terribly inclined to watch a screen all day. And there are a lot of kids who aren't comfortable sitting in a classroom with their butt in a chair all day, let alone at home watching a screen all day. And parents are now, then the parents were working from home and they're trying to work, and then they're trying to help their kids do what they think their kids are supposed to do. And it just becomes an awful lot of parental struggle, kids not learning, kids not socializing, kids not getting their needs met, parents not able to do what they need to do. And it's just been a horror story for many, many kids and families.
Yeah, you talk about kids not socializing, and I've come to realize that our brains are, to some degree, fairly large degree, I think, socially constructed, that to maintain our thought processes, etc., social stimulation and contact, even beyond the screen, is helpful, but it's not the same thing as in person.
Absolutely true. We are social animals.
Yeah.
And we're designed to live in communities, tribes, if you will. And when that's taken away from us, and now we're not only in our nuclear family, but we're isolated within the silo of our nuclear family, which is sometimes 4 people, 3 people,
8 people.
Yeah. Well, eventually we get on each other's nerves.
Yeah.
And we don't have those escape valves to burn off some energy, get our needs met in different ways, in different places. And it becomes a very difficult thing.
Yeah. And I'm also thinking that there are developmental stages that kids, going back to kids, that kids go through. And those developmental stages are being have been messed with big time by the social isolation, by either going to school virtually or not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
very much so.
Yeah.
Just to be fair, David, some kids and families, some teens and families have done very well.
Yeah.
And why have they done very well? Well, certain kids who maybe, this is a little weird, but some kids who are maybe spectrum and have a hard time socializing, and they could just be home and doing what they do on the computer and having their recreation on gaming. They were in heaven. And then there were other kids who certainly missed a lot of social engagement and time and activities, but did their best. They did online dance class or music class and kept up with things, and they had a lot of parental resources and support for such things, and maybe created social pods with families that had agreed that they wouldn't expose themselves unnecessarily outside of the pod. So certain families and certain kids with certain kinds of special needs and other kids without special needs, but very resourced, those families and those kids did very well during this period of time, and I don't think lost too much.
Yeah.
Other kids lost socially, they lost emotionally, and they lost academically, and parents lost years because when we talk about parental burnout, they really, really struggled, and it was extremely, really difficult. It was extremely difficult for them. And then if you think about the dynamic that I wrote about in my book, Ending the Parent-Teen Control Battle, boy, did I see some control battles.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll bet.
Yeah. So those negative patterns of interaction that certain kids and families were inclined towards got significantly worse during these periods of virtual learning and sequestering
Yeah.
of the kids and children. Yeah. Quarantining.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's both, but there's a lot of stress and there's a lot of loss as a result of this pandemic. You know, one of the groups, David, that I think suffered enormously is the young adult population, those kids that were going off to college.
Yeah.
And then got to college and they either sat in their dorm room and were trying to do virtual. They couldn't quite figure out how to be social because there were so many rules about it and how to be. Many came home, and I have this saying, which is God makes 18-year-olds obnoxious so you won't be too sad when they go off to college. But then they went off to college at home and their obnoxiousness was still with them. And you can't tell me what to do because I'm at college now.
Wow. Yeah.
And some of whom became depressed and in their rooms, often sometimes with substance abuse behaviors and issues, and or gaming addictions. Some kids who would go out against their parents' wishes and bring risk back into the family.
Wow. Yeah. I hadn't thought about that.
And so, you know, there's a lot of young adult trauma to the kids and to their families as a result of the what we had to give up as a result of the pandemic.
Yeah, I'm thinking that there's probably a spectrum of health or distress in families. That some families are the adults in the family are all psychologically fit and well balanced, and consequently their kids have good resources and modeling, all the way to families that are very dysfunctional and also who are stressed by a lack of financial resources, minority families that are already dealing with issues of inequality and so on. So there are some people that are set up well for resilience, and their kids are set up for resilience.
Exactly.
And others who are, even without the pandemic, have been struggling, and this pandemic just has to exacerbate the situation.
I think it has indeed, and I think that we're speaking about that kind of social economic divide that in our country keeps getting worse, and so minority communities definitely take the brunt of social environmental dilemmas such as we have with the pandemic.
Yeah.
Right. So when there's inflation, who suffers the most. When there's a recession, who suffers the most. When there's layoffs, who suffers the most. And with climate change, who suffers the most. And so with this pandemic, it's exactly the same. Who suffers the most? Those
Right.
who don't have the resources in the bank and underneath them and in their communities.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, for many families, it's or maybe for all of us, it's highlighted issues around death and illness. I think so many of us know people who have gotten sick, who may even have, as you say, long-term COVID issues.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so I'm wondering, in your practice, have you had to have conversations and discussions with people who, young people, older people who are dealing with issues of loss and death?
I have not. The population I work with is, children, teens, young adults, and families. I do have friends who have lost parents. I have friends who have long haul and have experienced and are experiencing that. One thing I have experienced is a divide within nuclear family between parents about whether or not to follow guidelines or not, whether we're going to get vaccinations or not, whether or not we're going to mask or not. So that's a social ill that has reared its ugly head in the wake of this pandemic, and that's been quite a trauma for families to have to negotiate.
As a therapist, how do you help families through that? Help couples through that internal divide in their system?
Well, I I was really stumped when I first got presented with it because I'm strong leaning on following the government guidelines, and I saw nothing. I didn't lose anything significant by wearing a mask, and I believe that even if I think that I have a very strong immune system and I'm fine, if I get COVID, I'll do fine with it. I don't want to be a carrier and give it to someone else who's going to be less fine with it. So I have a strong value on we need to take care of ourselves and each other. And so we need to follow the guidelines, and we need to deprive this virus of a host. And if the virus doesn't get a host, it can't mutate and it can't grow and it can't spread. So I feel very strongly about that. And so when I was confronted with clients who are presenting another point of view, which is this is a hoax, it's being played on us by China, the Democrats are supporting it, and we can't have the government telling us what to do, and they're going to put microchips in our bodies and all this other stuff that I consider nonsense. I have to go back and say, okay, what's my job as a therapist here?
Yeah.
What is my job?
Yeah.
And my job is to help people get clear about their priorities and how to talk to each other, how to care about each other, and how to relate in a way that's healthy. It's not to come down on one side or the other of any argument. I don't advocate one kind of parenting over another kind of parenting short of abuse. I do want to help families remember what they care about most, and that they care about each other, and they care about the welfare of their family and their leadership within that family, and ways to manage differences between parental points of view. So that became my focus.
Yeah. And that's actually, I've always been impressed by people who do family therapy, because that's definitely a skill that any family therapist needs to develop, to be able to not take sides. And the strong pull often, within the therapist, I think, as a human being, is, hey, this person's really likable. This person seems obnoxious.
Right.
And for you as a therapist to somehow remember that center place that you are committed to come from.
Right. I have to see this unit as my client, not any individual within that unit.
Yeah.
If you're a family therapist, you think, where does the problem live? Does it live inside of a person, or does it live in the space between us?
Yeah. And you've been a family therapist for how long?
For my entire career. So that's what drew me to family therapy. That's what drew me to psychotherapy, was the idea of family. And I had been a teacher in southern Colorado, near the New Mexico border in the San Luis Valley, and I was working with children and teens and young adults in a school for developmentally delayed children, teens, and young adults, because it's so rural that it takes every age group. And in working with those families, in those kids, I went out and visited the families of those kids, many of whom were impoverished and lived in little shacks way out in the country and with very minimal resources, very impoverished Latino kids. There's a very interesting population there. I could talk about that another time. But what I realized is, when I talked to the parents and I said, boy, we love having your kid in school in broken Spanish. And they told me in broken English, that they felt like they were thrilled to know I cared. And suddenly those kids did better in school. They were more respected and taken care of in their home, and they were no longer a source of embarrassment to their parents. They were, and the parents would come to potlucks, and when the kids went to the Special Olympics, they were proud of their children and their ability to do that. And it made just a huge difference in the behavior and the life and the learning of these children. And so I thought, wow, I feel kind of like a country doctor, except I'm not a doctor. It just felt, really rewarding for me as a young 20-something year old. And so then I discovered there was a field of study called family therapy. And then I was trying to just figure out how I would learn about this field of study. And there was the University of Denver Graduate School of Social Work had Family Therapy 1 and Family Therapy 2 in its curriculum. And I said, this is for me. So I went and took that, and eventually spent a month at the Philadelphia Child Guidance Center in Philadelphia with when Sal Minuchin was the director. I went to structural family therapy trainings up and down the West Coast where I was working, and I even had some time with Carl Whitaker, and of course the Palo Alto Mental Research Institute. It was right near where I was living in California, and so I would do trainings with them. Which I think has some of the most brilliant minds in psychotherapy of all time. And so I was a student of all that, and I've just remained a student. And my book, in fact, is a development from all those schools of thought. I really owe that time of psychotherapy development, everything to my career. It's been so rewarding for me.
Yeah, you really have a rich foundation to call upon, because not only were you in the process of developing during that time, but the field really was in its developmental infancy in some ways, and going into its adolescence, and you got to be part of that and live through that.
I was a great beneficiary of all that creative thinking of that time.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, you haven't mentioned being a grandparent. Are you and your wife, are you grandparents yet or not?
I suspect we will be in the next few years. My older son Daniel is getting married this fall, and I think he and his bride to be are thinking in those terms.
Uh-huh.
When
Well,
you,
good.
when you
Yeah.
buy a 4-bedroom house, I guess you're thinking that you're going to have kids.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Well, I am a grandparent at this point, a rather unexpected surprise grandparent that uh, ended up being, we have 7 grandchildren. And so I have to say that's been a sustaining thing for me and my wife, our feelings for our grandkids, and it adds another dimension of richness to life. But I'm wondering, going back to the effect of the pandemic and so on, that grandparenting is somehow affected by all of this. And have you had any experience of that in the work that you've been doing? Have you been talking to grandparents or hearing about issues between parents and grandparents or kids and their grandparents?
Well, that's an interesting question. What I've experienced is a lot of grandparents functioning in primary caregiving, primary parenting roles. So
Yeah.
I've seen grandparents come live with their children and providing care for the families, raising their grandchildren and providing support for the parents. And it's also been an escape valve. Grandparents have been an escape valve for kids and parents as well if they live nearby. That's been a change that's happened.
Yeah, I know that often grandparents were not expecting to raise another family. They thought they were done.
Yeah.
But the economy is such, and along with the pandemic has kind of shifted that, and they find themselves in that role unexpectedly.
Yeah, well, I've seen with young adults in particular, when they and their parents are really struggling and at each other's throats, that they'll often go live with their grandparents. And young adults are a little more solicitous of their grandparents' needs and than they are of their parents'
Right.
needs. So
Yeah.
they'll go live with their grandparents and go to college online. So they'll have a bedroom and go to college, but they're a little more respectful and solicitous of the grandparents' limits and needs than there will be of their own parents.
Yeah.
What a great resource that families have benefited from. I think you said it before, we are designed to be socially engaged. And our brains work best when we're socially engaged. So when we shrink down our social environment so that we don't have that breadth and that depth, it really hurts us. And having grandparents, aunts, uncles, neighbors that we can rely on, the school communities. I mean, school communities are so important. And then there's sports teams and sports communities and all kinds of things, and equestrian communities. There's communities of everything, and music communities. And those communities are so important to people. When we lose those, we lose ourselves.
Yeah.
Was it Willie Nelson's line? Or no, Jerry Jeff Walker, I missed myself while you were gone.
Yeah, that's a good
Yeah.
line.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, maybe the pandemic in some ways has, and seems strange to talk about this way, but maybe it bestows some gifts as well. And one of the gifts has been, in some cases, to drive us back to an earlier kind of time when families were extended families, and there was more of that a built-in interdependence between family members. And then in the American dream, at least, we're dominated by images of independence and breaking away from all those drags on our independence, But this is forcing us back to a rediscovery of some of the joys and benefits of being in closer contact with people that we're related to.
I think being isolated from those broader relationships, I think we've come to realize or some of us have come to realize how important they really are to us, and those that have been able to benefit from those relationships have once again rediscovered how important those relationships are and how valuable our elders are to us, and how important they are to families. And I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying.
Yeah. So I think we should keep our eyes open for the possible silver linings in the clouds here. And they are there, and there have been remarkable instances of that one learns about in the news or hears about one way or another, of small communities that have come together either around artistic pursuits or music or or as you say, dance, some other things like that. I was on your website, and I see that during the period that we've not been in contact with one another, you've become a podcaster.
But then it's been a long time since we've been in contact with each other, because I podcast mostly weekly, and I've got over 200 podcasts. So it's obviously been a while since we've been connected. But yes, I have my podcast, Healthy Family Connections.
What led you to make the decision to become a podcaster?
That's a good question. I'm like yourself, David. I'm in those years of my career where I'm just thinking about adding value. There's some things from that whole period of my therapeutic development of family therapy and the whole concept of change from the Palo Alto Mental Research Institute and brief therapy. There's so much that I'm carrying. I'm just not seeing it in the current population of young therapists who are thinking much more about attachment theory. They're thinking about trauma. They're thinking about, which are all completely legitimate things to think about. They're thinking about social equality and inequality and gender spectrum issues and neurodiversity. Boy, do I care about those issues. They are really, really important. But I'm concerned that we're forgetting to think about the human experience in our family environments and what change really means and how you create change in families and in individuals. And so I developed this podcast as an opportunity to help families and help therapists help families with a point of view of how you change a homeostatic, dysfunctional situation, how you create change and shift the whole dynamic of that, that relates to the identified problem. We've always talked about the IP as the identified patient.
Yes.
And so when parents write me, they're writing about their difficult child or adolescent or young adult, or their difficult spouse, and they don't fully understand their role in maintaining the pattern of interaction with their child or their spouse.
Yeah.
And so how to create a shift in the thinking and in the behavior. So I outline some ways to think about the problem, and then a set of interventions that can actually shift a problem.
That sounds wonderful. And so on your website, you actually solicit people to submit a problem that can then become the focus of the website of
my podcast
episode.
Yeah.
Sometimes, and I don't know how often you bring in an outside guest. One of the episodes that I listen to, you brought somebody else in. Is that a thing you regularly do, or just some of the time?
Mostly, I have done my own work. I've taken the problem that the person has sent me, and I've created my own analysis and thought, done my own brain racking, and then got my bullet points and did my podcast. Very recently, I've had an associate who's a parent of young adult children, Robin Holland, join me so that it can be more conversational, much like we're having today.
Right.
It often was taking me 6 hours to create a 20-minute podcast, and I was getting a little exhausted from that. And plus, my energy comes up in interacting with others. And so when I'm just in my own head thinking about things, and I got my bullet points and I'm reporting about things, I'm a little more boring.
Right.
Than
That's why I've been doing it around guests all these years.
Uh-huh.
And I think I've probably done about 1,000 at this point.
Wow.
Yeah. So,
wow.
So this is a way for both of us to keep our brains stimulated with some interaction going on. So tell us again the name of your podcast, because I may lose some listeners in your direction, but it sounds like it would be a good thing for them.
Yeah. I certainly wouldn't want to compete. I think enriching, and I think both podcasts can be wonderful.
Enrich.
My podcast is called Healthy Family Connections, and you can get it wherever you get your podcasts. You can get Healthy Family Connections, and I'd love to have more listeners. So feel free to come, you all. I'd love to have you.
Yeah, and that's a great title too.
Yeah. One thing I haven't mentioned, I think, in going back to our original question about how has the pandemic affected kids and families, I've been seeing teenagers and young adults looking about 12 to 24 months younger than I'm used to seeing that. So I'm seeing 15-year-olds that look and act socially more like 13-year-olds.
Yes. I've seen this in our own family, I have to say.
Young adults who are clearly not embracing their young adulthoods, that look a lot more like difficult 16 or 15-year-olds. And so I think that's one thing that we have to think about as a therapeutic community, is that when we are getting kids, teens, and young adults, they might be presenting as much younger than they are, and we have to take into consideration the impact of the pandemic on their social emotional development.
Yeah, they become developmentally arrested in a way.
Yeah. And so I think we'd make a mistake to overdiagnose necessarily. And really, I think what we want to prescribe is a lot of maturational opportunity for these kids and to believe in them and to say, you know what, you're capable of more. So let's support you in doing more. Let's resource you in doing more. And let's get you believing in yourself. Let's get your parents believing in you, because I'm a professional and I can see you've got it. And now we just need to help it emerge, as opposed to, and we have to be very, very mindful not to pathologize this regression or lack of development.
I'm really glad you got that point in here. And this might be a good place for us to wrap it up with that good, strong point. So family therapist Neil D. Brown, thanks for being my guest again on Shrink Rap Radio.
David, thanks so much for having me. It's always a pleasure.